Greetings, this is Jerry Sitzer. I'm going to be resuming a presentation on the history of Christianity, but this time I'm going to focus on religion in America, and really religion in American public life. I'm going to make it pretty straightforward and simple right from the get-go by actually reading my thesis, or what I'm going to be arguing through this brief lecture. I'm going to focus on the unfolding story of the role of religion in what I call the American experiment of a democratic republic. We did something really new in world history in America, and Christianity really did play an important role. So I'm going to read this to make it as clear as possible. There's no nation on earth that can tell a story like the American story. It's easy to idealize it or to demonize it. We've done both. There's plenty of evidence for both lines of argument. In either case, it is clear the story is unusual and even unique. No nation has witnessed the emergence of a liberal democratic republic that has lasted so long and adapted so well, nor a religious environment, mostly Christian, that has contributed so clearly to the flourishing of the nation, often but not always in good ways. Now, I'm going to be asking a question for the next half hour. What kind of role should Christianity play in the American social and political order? Is there a kind of ideal here that we should strive for? And what lessons does history teach us that could be helpful in answering that question? All right, the beginning of the story, briefly. As we know, the American story did not begin with Europeans. It began with Native American tribes that were spread all over what we now call the United States. And they didn't always get along. They weren't all the same. They were all very disparate cultures with different disparate practices, some peace-loving, some warmongering, very diverse populations. But they were the original Americans who had lived here for thousands of years. Europeans arrived in the 15th, very late 15th and early 16th century, and they carried a worldview with them, a worldview that was profoundly confident. They believed that they were special to God. They were entirely Christian. They believed that they had a superior civilization. And they also had a kind of expansionist mindset about wanting to travel the world and bring it under the dominance of Europeans. Now, they were mission-minded too, so we don't want to demonize them. They were a mixed bag. Some that were only interested in gold and territory and expansion and wealth, and others that really wanted to win groups of people that they were meeting for the first time for the sake of the gospel. It's both and, it's not either or. Well, as I said, they began to arrive in the very late 15th and early 16th century. There were three patterns they followed. One was conquest, mostly Spanish, but not entirely, both in Central, South, and in now what we call North America. Exploration, and here the French were especially distinguished. And colonization, and by far the most successful group of people to colonize in what they called the New World were the British. Now, as we well know by now, there were notable failures from a Christian perspective. They practiced extermination of native populations or displacement, driving them away from their land, often through war. We know that they practiced slavery. The first slave was brought over to the New World from Africa in the year 1619, and that practice continued well into the 19th century. And they also practiced the mindset of manifest destiny, that they had a kind of right to be able to expand and to conquer territories that did not belong to them. We also know there were prophetic voices. Please remember that. Early on, Bartholomew de las Casas, the first priest ordained in the New World, traveled back and forth between the New World and Europe to plead the case of native tribes. And he did this as a Christian. As you can see in the slide, at one point he writes, "In God's name, consider what sort of deeds are these, and whether it squares well with such Christians as these to call the Indians devils, and whether it could be worse to give Indians into the charge of devils of hell than Christians of the Indies." In other words, he was saying of these conquistadors, explorers, people from Spain, your behavior is actually worse than what the devils would do in the way they treated native populations. Roger Williams and William Penn, the founder of Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, both actually paid to use Indian lands and were very peaceful in the way they approached Indians or native populations. The Jesuits evangelized very successfully and often paid a price for it through martyrdom. John Eliot was an early Puritan missionary who tried to share the gospel with native populations instead of enslave them. So we have right from the beginning alternative prophetic voices. You'll see a couple of images here. This one, of course, is a very romanticized view of a very noble-looking Columbus who carried a flag, Spanish, a sword, conquest, but also wanted to evangelize these peoples that he met for the first time. So again, very mixed motives and very mixed results. These are a couple of photos, or not photos, but images of De las Casas, one of my personal heroes, who was a great leader of the church, but also defended the rights of native populations. This is Roger Williams, who paid for land that he eventually was given by native tribes. And here's John Eliot. Well, as you know, settlements were eventually created all along the Atlantic seaboard. There was Puritan New England, Dutch New Amsterdam that eventually became British New York, Anglican Virginia, Catholic Maryland, Baptist Rhode Island, Quaker Pennsylvania, all down the colonies, these different nationalities and especially even more important religious groups that settled and began to build colonies and so on. And they became official colonies, the 13 colonies in the 18th century. They followed, in almost all cases, a European model of established churches, that is, state-supported churches, and then anybody who didn't agree with them were called dissenting churches. So in Puritan New England, for example, there was the Congregational Church that was supported by not the state, but the colonies. Clergy were paid by the colonies. They enforced laws that imposed Puritan worship on people, so on and so forth. Dissenters, Roger Williams, for example, were sometimes driven out of those colonies, and then they would start new colonies or new settlements. So that European model prevailed, but it didn't work. And the reason why is there was simply too much religious diversity and too much open land. So if there was disagreement, Roger Williams could simply pack up his bags, travel 50 miles, and start another settlement where he had freedom to do so. Through it all, the British eventually began to dominate until the New World became their property. Eventually, as you know the story, the colonists rebelled, and that led to the War of Independence in 1776 and following. Two important documents were written during this period, both familiar to you. One, the Declaration of Independence, and the other one, the Constitution, 1776 and 1789. Here you see a slide of the established church in Boston or New England, colonial churches in Boston to the left and New Haven to the right. A great example of that early colonial architecture as well, and these were the dominant churches. They had the most wealth, the most power, the institutions, and everything else. This is an early dissenter, Anne Hutchinson, who started a Bible study in her home and eventually was driven out of Massachusetts Bay in 1636. She was doing things that were, quote, unfitting for her sex, as they called it. Quakers were persecuted by everybody back then until they could find their own spaces in Pennsylvania, especially in order to find freedom to be able to practice their own religion that was suspect by other Christian groups. And they suffered quite a bit of persecution until they could move to places where they could start over. All right, now, eventually they wrote a constitution to create a new kind of government that became the first of its kind in all of human civilization, a democratic republic. They borrowed extensively from philosophers in the old world, but they also borrowed from Christianity. We see that they read a lot of sources, and they put those sources together and used them to be able to create a different kind of system of government. The Declaration of Independence talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke had said pursuit of property. And then with the Constitution, they created a document that was not primarily religious. In Europe, any kind of document would begin with something like in the name of the king or in the name of God. But in America, the Constitution begins with we the people. They rejected the threat of tyranny. They want to create a government that served the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people. A government that was limited, that had separation of powers, that was balanced, and that followed a written constitution to hold it accountable, from president all the way down. It was a representative democracy intended to protect and preserve freedom that was enshrined in the Bill of Rights passed in 1791 by the new Congress, and then amendments, and then affirmed by all of the states. Now, what we don't realize is that all the framers and founders of early America argued that the only way this new experiment in government would succeed is if the people living under it were immoral and responsible. In parentheses, what they meant was a religious people. In other words, it was dependent on maturity, on character, on the cultivation of virtue. And they believed that that was in the hands of religion. And by religion, of course, they meant Christianity. And actually, back then, it wasn't just Christianity, it was Protestant Christianity. But it had to be a Christianity that operated independently, that was not state established, that was operating on its own terms. So in the First Amendment, it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. We're not going to favor one over another, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, there was a reason for that clear, quote, separation of church and state. And James Madison tells us why. What influence have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In other words, the state church. In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instance have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of people. Religion has to be free, it has to be independent, it has to operate on its own terms. Now, what most people don't realize is that right after the constitutional period, say in the year, 1795, this was actually the low ebb of religion in American history. 15% or fewer people in American colonies attended church. And everyone was asking, how are Christians going to handle this freedom of religion? What would be the losses as well as the gains? The loss, of course, was no establishment, no government favor, no government support. religion on its own terms. The gain was freedom, free exercise. It leveled the playing field. The most established churches were not going to have a distinct advantage over newcomers. I'll give you an example in just a minute. In other words, they had space, freedom to be creative, and a competitive environment. You could call it a kind of religious free market system. Now, here's an example. In the year 1790, the Puritans, Congregationalists, and the Anglicans had all the advantages. They had the schools, numbers of churches, educated clergy, and simply bodies in the pew. Clearly the advantage. By 1850, they were number 7 and 8 in size, not 1 and 2, surpassed by Baptists, Presbyterians, and the very new Methodists. Level playing field. They didn't have the same advantages in spite of their numbers and wealth and so on and so forth. Lots of newcomers were beginning to gain a foothold in the New World because of their religious freedom. Well, not everybody liked this. Lyman Beecher was a member of the kind of Puritan establishment, a Congregationalist, very, very well-known clergy in that particular period in the late 18th and early 19th century. And at first he opposed freedom of religion, but he changed his mind. And this is one of my favorite quotes from him. This establishment was one of, quote, the best things that ever happened in America. Churches cut loose from dependence on state support, found a renewed vigor and forcefulness, relying wholly on their own resources and on God. They moved forward with swift and astonishing speed to meet the challenges of a rapidly moving frontier and a rapidly expanding population. Well, what we see is a burst of creativity and energy in two ways. First, the Second Great Awakening exploded in now not the colonies, but the states in the New World, in the English and the Atlantic seaboard, but also across the Appalachians in what's called the Second Great Awakening. On the frontier, it was led by people like Francis Asbury, an early Methodist leader, and Peter Cartwright, a Presbyterian. On college campuses by the president of Yale, Timothy Dwight, grandson of Jonathan Edwards, and in the northern cities by the very famous Charles Finney, one of the early evangelists and crusaders in American religion. And this led to a massive movement of conversion over the next 35 years or so, increasing significantly the percentage of church attenders in America at the time. But it also led to all kinds of other things. A number of voluntary societies, what we now call nonprofits, exploded. The American Bible Society, American Sunday School Union, the Temperance Society, Foreign Missions, Anti-Slavery, dozens and dozens of these organizations that were taking on important causes and spreading the influence of Christianity in the social order. John Wesley created a method of discipleship called the class system that came to the New World. The Methodists started officially in America in 1784. By 1850, it had over 1 million members. Denominations founded literally hundreds of church-related colleges all through along the eastern seaboard, but especially spilling into the Midwest. And the church grew in America significantly during that period of time. So rather than state or established religion that was dominated by the government, we have a free religion that is able to function as salt, leaven, and light in our society. A couple of slides to show you. This is the very famous Beecher family. I've already mentioned Lyman Beecher. One of his children was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Henry Beecher is called one of the most famous men in 19th century America. He was a famous preacher. We see Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale University, used to debate students and preach in chapel, and saw a massive conversion happen in Yale in the year 1801. Francis Asbury, an early leader of Methodists, and Peter Cartwright of Presbyterians, they used a new method of evangelism called camp meetings on the frontier, again in the early 19th century, and Charles Finney, who led crusades in more established cities on the eastern seaboard. Now, I'm going to let you read quotes over the next few slides. A French aristocrat came to the United States in the 1830s. He came to study why it was that democracy in America appeared to be succeeding in a way that was far beyond what the Europeans were expecting. They were thinking within one generation the thing would utterly collapse. How could you have a government that was of and by and for the people? That was simply impractical. And so he came to discover why it had succeeded in America and wrote an 800-page book called Democracy in America. Now, he said there are lots of reasons why it succeeded. Accidents of nature, for example. We have a lot of natural resources in the United States, in the New World back then. Institutions that proved to be very successful, especially on kind of the local level. We don't have any natural enemies at our borders, he observed. But one of the reasons had to do with what he called the indirect influence of Christianity. Christianity operates with a great deal of influence in America, but it's always indirect in what it does in the home, for example, and what it does in churches and what it does in local communities. Christians, he said, are very busy people in America. They're very industrious people. They're always organizing things. And they're creating a kind of social infrastructure that helped make democracy in America successful. He called it the habits of restraint. In a sense, he was saying, the Constitution gives us our freedom and religion takes it away by disciplining people, helping them be obedient to God. He also contrasted that with Europe. In Europe, religion had a tendency of aligning with one particular political party or one particular kind of government. But the minute that party or government fell out of favor, so did the religion. He said in America, Christian groups are more independent. They maintain a critical distance. They operate without approval or much opposition from the powers that be. So instead of being primarily a Christian Republican or a Christian Democrat, they were just Christians. And they could be Democrats or Republicans, but their loyalty or their greater loyalty was elsewhere. He talked about the political influence of Christianity, and this quote I will read. Religion, which never intervenes directly in the government of American society, should therefore be considered as the first of their political institutions. Seems contradictory. For although it did not give them the taste for liberty, it singularly facilitates the use thereof. So he's saying, in effect, Christianity doesn't actually give you any liberty. It calls you to give up your liberty in the face of Jesus Christ. But then it helps you to live as a responsible human being in society. And that's exactly what this democratic experiment needed from its people. How could society escape destruction if, when political ties are relaxed, as we find in the United States, moral ties are not tightened? And what can be done with a people master of itself if it is not subject to God? Christians, he said, focus on the kingdom of God. Their allegiance is ultimately elsewhere. Well, in this particular period, Christianity in America is called the Benevolent Empire. It was enormously successful from 1801 to about 1850. But old challenges persisted and new challenges emerged. Old challenges, no surprise, were how Americans treated Native Americans. Slavery, which eventually led to denominational divisions, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists all divided over disagreements about slavery. There were prophetic voices, both within the African American community, Frederick Douglass, as well as abolitionists from the white population, the Grimke sisters and Theodore Weld. Abraham Lincoln warned about the devastating impact on slavery in America and how religions parted ways because of their view of slavery. This was profoundly destructive in American society, and the Civil War did not solve the problem, as you know. Reconstruction had a brief period with some limited success, but eventually Jim Crow laws took over and were approved by the Supreme Court in 1896, and we still deal, obviously, with racism to this very day. But new challenges emerged as well. The growing industrialization of American society after the Civil War, urbanization, and immigration. To give you one brief anecdote, city of Chicago in 1837 had 4,000 people. By 1890, it had 1 million. And most of the population were immigrants, and most of them lived in tenement houses. There was a tremendous problem of disparity between the rich and the poor, with no easy or immediate solutions at hand. Here are a couple of slides that just expose the curse of slavery in American society, but also the prophetic voices that came out of the African American community in slave religion. It's amazing that they became Christians, but in becoming Christians, they realized one of their enemies was white Christianity. One of the great theologians of Christianity was the only non-church-going president we've had, Abraham Lincoln, as you can see here in his second inaugural. And meanwhile, we had a lot of rich white people buying pew space, attending church, without much thought given to the disparity between rich and poor. But again, Christians began to make a difference. I call this not the benevolent empire, but now the benevolent influence. There was another low point in American religion, and that was the late 19th century. But then some Christians began to talk about Christian social responsibility. A new theology emerged called the theology of the social gospel that tried to apply Christian moral principles to institutions and social problems. All kinds of new initiatives and organizations were founded. Massive city churches that were providing education for immigrants and job placement and classes of all kinds to get people back on their feet. The YMCA, the Salvation Army, a little later Boy Scouts, the Union Movement, the Catholic Worker Movement by Dorothy Day, Settlement House. I mean, massive movement among Christians, often a minority of Christians, that were trying to address these new problems in American society: industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. Eventually, that led to the passage of new laws, for example, labor laws and union laws, that helped more Americans on the poor side of things get back on their feet and begin to enjoy kind of the American dream. Behind it was this question that loomed: is it possible to Christianize not just people, but to Christianize society? There were two extremes that emerged. Christianity is oriented toward this world, social justice, or toward the next world. And I ask the question, why can't it be both? It seems to be so in the New Testament. Here we see Walter Rauschenbusch, one of the early leaders in the social gospel movement. Dwight Moody led all kinds of crusades in the North and did spawn some socially responsible things from a more conservative perspective, including the founding of Bible schools. Dorothy Day, a convert to Catholicism, who founded the Catholic Worker Movement. Jane Addams, the Settlement House movement. One of the questions that emerged in the early 20th century because of what happened during the same period, was what kind of Christianity would prevail? Is there a true Christianity, and who determines what it is? And this led to realignments in American Christianity. The old alignments were mainstream Protestantism, Presbyterian, for example, evangelical holiness movements, Catholic, of course, and their numbers grew precipitously in the late 19th century, Irish, Polish, and so on. And finally, really experimental religions, many of which were not really even Christian, like the Mormons. But new alignments began to emerge that we're familiar with to this very day. The modernist movement, which adapted to kind of Enlightenment and scientific ideas, often at the expense of Orthodox Christianity. Fundamentalism, often at the expense of a kind of generous orthodoxy. And the Pentecostal movement, which became more anti-intellectual and emotional. Two important symbolic events were the outbreak of the Pentecostal movement at the Azusa Street Revival in 1906 in Los Angeles, and the Scopes trial, which pitted modernists against fundamentalists in 1925. And this was very disorienting for American religion as these new alignments began to emerge, many of which we're still living with today. This is a very famous photo, by the way, of Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, the two opponents in the Scopes trial in 1925, which was a media sensation, by the way. This is a photo of early Pentecostal leaders. Notice how diverse it is, much more so than a lot of mainstream religion was in America. This is an example of an early photo of Black Pentecostalism. And an important female leader of the Pentecostal movement, Aimee Semple McPherson, who started the Foursquare movement in the 1920s. Well, what we enter in this last phase I want to touch on very briefly were international threats to Christian civilization. Earlier on in American history, our enemies were mostly within, slavery, for example, or our treatment of Native Americans, or urbanization, industrialization. But beginning in the 19-teens, the story changes. For example, the Great War, or what we know as World War I, pitted Christian nations at war against each other outside the American context. And then the rise of ideologies, Nazism, communism, fascism, followed by the Great Depression, and then World War II, and shortly after that, the Cold War, all within about a 50-year period of time. I mean, you look back on this now and you think this was just utterly catastrophic. And all of that raised the question, is Christian civilization as we understand it at stake? Will it survive these new military ideological challenges to our worldview assumptions? And what should we do about it? And this led to what we know as a post-war resurgence of religion, Christianity, in America. Will the Christian West survive? And more Christian leaders were saying, only if there's some kind of revival of Christianity. So after World War II, there was a tremendous resurgence of interest in Christianity in America. This was the peak period of mainline Christianity, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Methodist by then, and so on and so forth. Peak period of building program, mission budgets, the number of people sitting in pews, seminary attendance, all across the board, a peak period. There were buildings that went up and big budgets and missionary enterprises. And then the rise of the even neo-evangelical movement under Billy Graham, for example, and the National Association of Evangelicals, and new organizations like Young Life, Youth for Christ, and Campus Crusade for Christ, and InterVarsity. All kinds of new mission organizations emerged after World War II to be able to affirm the power and importance of Christianity for a lot of reasons, but one of them was the actual survival of Western civilization. The slide you show now are two big Presbyterian churches, both of which became packed after World War II, National Pres and then our own First Pres in Spokane. The very famous Billy Graham, who became a national celebrity beginning in around 1950 and remained that way well into the 21st century. The National Association of Evangelicals, founded in 1943, and Christianity Today in 1956, and then 4 portraits of important leaders in, again, this neo-evangelical movement. Bill Bright, Jim Rayburn, Bob Pierce, and Henrietta Mears, who taught a whole generation of college students at Hollywood Presbyterian Church. Fuller Seminary, founded in 1947, and Wycliffe Bible Translators, also 20th century. Very important organizations in this resurgence of religion. Well, now we've entered a new phase, the kind of what I would call the end of cultural Christendom in America. We all know there's a kind of growing secularity that we see around us, and the loss of religious influence leads to the decline of churches and the decline of Christian institutions and the rise of what we call nones, that is, those who check the no affiliation, no belief box in religious surveys. This is going to be surprising, but in 1965, less than 5 people would check a box that said no affiliation or no religious belief at all. And now that number is 30% within 2 generations. We value diversity and pluralism, but some people see it now as a threat to the importance of Christianity in American history. And there's been movements of resistance. The Moral Majority was founded in 1980 to kind of reassert Christianity and Christian influence in America. They want to bring America back to God, as they put it. The quest for a Christian America, the New Apostolic Reformation, is a more recent iteration of that. The rise of megachurches that are often very consumer-oriented, mainline adaptations and compromises. All of this is a kind of groping in the dark to figure out what to do as we sense that Christianity and Christian influence is slipping in American history. Well, a recent article in The Atlantic calls the 21st century the anti-social century. Institutions of all kinds are suffering decline in America. Boy Scouts, Rotary, unions, you name it, including churches. There's a lot of suspicion of institutions of all kinds, and people are seeing their failure. Scandals among Roman Catholics and the Southern Baptists would be 2 notable examples of that. And people are talking about not just a post-Christendom America, but a post-Christian America. And when you look at it from a certain angle of vision, you have to agree something is changing, and it feels alarming. But I have an analogy. I took my kids backpacking and hiking in Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s. Did this every summer, went to a national park. And we were on a long hike to climb a peak. And we walked through a stand of timber that had been scorched in a massive forest fire about 10 years before in Yellowstone National Park. 400,000 acres had been consumed. And through this, we felt like we were walking through a graveyard. It had been scorched by the wildfire. When you looked up, you saw all these trees still standing, giant trees, but they were all gray ghosts, like tombstones. They were all dead. So when you looked up, you saw nothing but death. When you looked down, you saw all the new growth, wildflowers and shrubs and small trees that were making their way skyward, signs of new life and new growth. And that is exactly what's happening. We are in a period of tremendous innovation and experiencing a lot of opportunity in American religion right now. We have what I would call an open field of play with very few competitors. So what can we learn from the church in pre-Christendom as we face post-Christendom? Do we really want cultural privilege and power at whatever cost? Is that really what we want? Do we want to clench our fist and flex our muscles and try to force America to become Christian again? Or do we develop a kingdom orientation where we emphasize the great tradition of historic Christian faith, the great commission to make disciples, and the great commandment to do it always in the spirit of love? That, it seems to me, is the pathway to follow. Thank you.